Hi everybody, it's great to be back here again. Tomorrow it's Friday. We're finishing the book of Bereshit. Today, as we begin, again, we're going to be beginning next week a new book of Shemot, of Exodus. It's always a good feeling to go through the Torah. Today I want to focus on the opening verses of the portion. And before I do so, it's sort of this Torah will be a reaction to a terrible, sad story in Israel. We all know in 2003, the tragedy when the astronaut Ilan Ramon was blown up when the space shuttle was trying to return to the atmosphere. The Columbia Space Shuttle. He was the first Israeli astronaut in space, and we're all familiar with that terrible tragedy. His wife Rona just passed away this week. They had a son in 2009 that was a pilot as well as the father, and he was killed in a tragic accident. We lost consciousness while he was flying, and the plane crashed over Hebron, the mountains of Hebron. So the question he was asked this week, and the story continues to being even more of a terrible story, when the wife, Rona Ramon, requested to be cremated this week. Instead of being buried, she felt that so much sorrow was brought to her family, and she didn't want to bring more sorrow through a funeral. She wanted to be cremated. That was her request. And I didn't hear if that happened. The rabbis are trying to convince the family to reverse the decision. It's a very difficult story when we hear it. And of course, no one could judge. It's difficult to judge, of course, anybody. Rona Ramon, she passed away of a terrible disease, cancer, at the age of 54. This whole story, of course, is one story of many tragic stories we hear throughout history, and they happen all the time. Families that have been plagued with multiple tragedies in their lifetime, and God forbid none of us should know from such terrible things. And people's lives should go smooth and with happiness, and not to see such sorrow and terrible things in their lifetime. But the question that the former chief rabbi of Israel, was asked when hearing this story, is your faith going to be shaken after this terrible story? And so I guess when the person asked the question, because there are many tragedies, like the Holocaust was a great tragedy, obviously, and that's what his really response was. I mean, we've experienced terrible tragedies in history, and the Holocaust was something you can't get any worse than that tragedy. And he said there are people that lost the faith and people that faith was strengthened, and he said his faith was really strengthened through that. But in reality, these are the hardest questions as anyone to deal with, to cope with, any rabbi or spiritual leader or any person in a lifetime trying to cope with tragedy and suffering, because it's one of the greatest questions. Why do people suffer in this world? And this week's portion, as it works out, I think could serve as a chizuk, as a strengthening, a little bit. It's difficult to understand the whole concept of death and understanding this world of suffering, what we go through and things like that. But this week's portion sort of opens the door to answer some of these questions that this week, the tragedy this week, that came out. Of course, if we look at the tragedy of the terrible piguim, the terrorist attacks that we experienced in the last couple of weeks, so these questions are constantly coming up over and over again. And I think we have a little bit understanding by going through in a little bit detail some of the verses in this week's portion. So let's begin. In Genesis 47, the portion opens up and it says, Vayechi Yaakov be'eretz Mitzrayim, and Yaakov was living in Egypt 17 shana, 17 years. Vayi yemei Yaakov shnei chayav sheva shanim v'arba'im u'me'at shana. And Yaakov's lifetime was 147 years old. And it begins by mentioning that he lived in Egypt 17 years. He lived in Egypt. And right away, well, I'll go on and read a few more verses because we're going to discuss the opening once. We'll get back to that. And it says in the next verse in 29, Vayikirvu yimei Yisrael lamut, and his days were coming closer to pass away. Vayikru livno liYosef, and he calls Joseph. Vayomer lo, im na matzadei chen beinecha, sim na yadcha tachat yirechi. If I found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh. V'asita imadi chesed, and do with me kindness and ve'emet and truth. Al na tikbarei Mitzrayim, don't bury me in Egypt. V'shachavti ma'avotai, I want to be. He goes, V'shachavti ma'avotai, I will lie with my fathers. V'nisatani b'Mitzrayim, take me out of Egypt. U'kvartani b'kvuratam, and bury me with them. Vayomar anochi aseh kedvarech, and Joseph says, I will do as you say, Father. Vayome hishavali, and Jacob makes him swear. Vayishavalo, vayishtachu Yisrael rosh hamita, and he swears, and Israel bows on the head of his bed. And these are the verses, the opening verses of this week's portion. First of all, the question is, we see right away that Jacob is getting closer to leave the world. His days are coming to an end. And he's extremely concerned and extremely worried about being buried in the land of Israel. He wants to go back to the land of Israel. That's so important to him, to go back to the land of Israel. And we see the Midrash brings down, it says that Jacob lived 17 years in Egypt. The Midrash says, Bal lamed, it comes to teach us, Shotan 17 shana shechaya Yaakov b'Mitzrayim, the 17 years that Yaakov lived in Egypt. Heim hayu chayim nimim, they were wonderful years of his lifetime. Chayei nachat, he had a life of relaxation, of peace. Sheyu banav b'nei banav tzviv l'shulchano, they were all around his table, his family. He finally got 17 years to really live life. V'oreh otam kulan parim v'ravim u'matzlichin, he sees his family having children and growing, the family's becoming a nation. U'mitbarchin b'chol minei brachot, and blessed with so many blessings. Aval kol otan hashanim shaya be'eretz Canaan, but the land, the years that he was in Egypt, right, he had a lot of trouble there. Esav hated him. He ended up going down to Lavan, and the whole thing what Lavan did to him. And he chased after him, and his daughter was raped, and Joseph was sold, and there was famine in the land. And all of a sudden he comes to Egypt, and wow, all of a sudden things seem to be working out the last 17 years. So that's what it says, and Jacob actually lived 17 years. These years were very special for him. And this Midrash immediately awakens within us, a question. I mean, the years of his suffering, the years that he had the challenges and the trials and the tribulations that Jacob went through, were years that he spent in the land of Eretz Yisrael, the land of the living, as we say, the land of Israel. And here, coming down to Galut, to exile, which is a terrible tragedy in exile. They had no choice but to leave because of the reasons they had to leave. And here Jacob lives in a special kind of atmosphere of happiness, surrounded by all the blessings. And here, of course, Midrash is trying to point out, trying to juxtapose the two sides over here, and to realize that sometimes what life seems to be beautiful and everything going so smoothly and everything so well, but it doesn't mean that those years in reality are the true years of reward, what a person does, and the years that a person has earned his keep in this world and rectified what he has to rectify in this world. We're going to develop this more. And we see this right away in the words of Nachmanides, of the Ramban. The Ramban says like this in response to those verses. The Ramban says, "Kvar iskarti ki redet Yaakov leMitzrayim hu galuteinu hayom biyad hachaya revid." He goes, when the Ramban, as we all know, Nachmanides describes each and every aspect of our forefathers, what they went through, as part of it's like a map, it's a roadmap of understanding the future. And he's saying when the fourth chaya, the fourth animal, mentioned in the book of Daniel, which refers to the Romans, Romi Harisha, the evil Roman Empire, which is the empire of Edom, which we are in right now. Ki bnei Yaakov heim atzmam savavu ridetam sham b'mechirat Yosef achi. And they said, the children of Yaakov themselves brought about they're going down to exile when they sold Joseph. V'Yaakov yirad sham mipnei ha'ra'av, and Jacob was forced to go down because of the famine. V'chashav v'ninatzel im beno b'bayit ohev lo, ki Paro ohev et Yosef kiben lo. Right? Because explaining that Jacob's coming down, there was no choice of survival to be in the house of his son who loves him, and he has the ability now to help him because he's loved by Paro. But they wanted to return to the land of Israel while they were alive. Right? They wanted to go back when they were still alive, when the famine would secede. So we came in to live because we have no way of living in the land of Canaan now. So it was a temporary coming down to Egypt. And he says, but behold, they didn't go back. But the exile was dragged on in Egypt. And they died there. Joseph ended up dying in Egypt as well, and his bones were taken back. And the elders brought, of course, Jacob back, and they made the great mourning. The Ramban goes on to say, he's saying, the same thing applies to us today. In the Romans and the Edomites, the last kingdom of mentioned Daniel, he goes, it was also because of our own brothers that brought about this exile. Because we made a covenant with the Romans. Agrippus was the king, one of the Hashmonaic dynasty, was, we all know, continuation of the dynasty of the Hashmonaim, and he comes and makes a pact with the Romans. Because of the famine, those in Jerusalem ended up being trapped. And the exile was very, very long. The Rambam goes on to talk about his time until his very time, the Middle Ages, how long the exiles continued. Lo noda kitzo kishal. We don't know the end of this exile like the other exiles. We knew their end. This last one, the Ramban says, we don't know when it's going to end. We are like the dead who are saying, we have no more hope anymore. The Rambam is praying that one day we will come out of all this, and it will be a great dream come true to come home, and a mourning for those who want to see Israel suffering. We will see God's avenging Israel's terrible tragedy in exile. So the Ramban is right away reflecting in his words here that, of course, the whole situation of living in exile and coming down to Egypt was a temporary situation, and we can't forget that. And here we see Jacob in this important message to his son Joseph. When things are going so well, that's why I brought down the Midrash. Everything is happening and so beautiful, but Jacob is yearning to return to the land of his fathers, to reminding everyone the importance of being in the land of Israel and coming back home. And here, even if he's going to come back, he realizes he's not going to be able to come back alive anymore, but he wants his body to be buried in the land of Israel. We see the Zohar Kadosh, the famous Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, in his Kabbalistic work of the Zohar, which is so important to study, of course. When people get to that level, as we know, the Torah is divided into different aspects. But all the prophecy, we know, prophecy continues. The secrets of prophecy were handed down within the Kabbalistic tradition. And that's what really makes Israel so unique, in that we have that tradition of prophecy, of how to, God willing, when the time comes, the prophets will be walking the land again. So the Kabbalah traditions are very, very powerful teachings of prophecy. It's all hidden within those books. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the master of the Zohar Kadosh. And of course, there are different levels of understanding. We're not going to have prophecy now because we're reading a few words of the Zohar Kadosh, but just to realize that how deep the Torah is really, and to realize that there are great days ahead for the land, for the world, when prophecy returns. But anyway, Zohar Kadosh writes regarding Yaakov Avinu, and I'd like to read a few words. He asks an important question. And he says, Yaakov mitve gufei alule ba'ara kadisha. Jacob, when he passes away, they brought him and his body were buried in the land of Israel. His flesh and his bones, everything was buried in the land. Yosef mit gufei lait kabar ba'ara kadisha ela gaumoi. Joseph dies and his body is not buried in the land of Israel, only his bones. Moshe lohai velohai. Moshe Rabbeinu, not this and not that. In other words, Moshe was buried outside the land. He didn't merit in having his body and his bones in the land of Israel. And here he goes on to talk about a very Kabbalistic explanation of what that means. We're not going to go there now, this difficult teaching of the Zohar Kadosh, but mentioning, of course, he's referring to the Sfirot, the spiritual channels of divine energy, of how everything is a certain rectification. And it's a very deep teaching in itself. But the point I want to really bring down from the Zohar is the question the Zohar is asking. The Zohar is saying is we see there's three types of, in the Torah, three types of our sages, our great biblical heroes. And one, like Moshe Rabbeinu, that was not even buried he didn't merit being buried in the land of Israel. How do we understand? And Joseph, only his bones were taken back, but it was so important to get his bones in the land. And Jacob, who merited in having his flesh and bones, everything buried in the land of Israel. And I want to take this question to what I brought up about, the question I brought up in the beginning of what goes on today, again, the suffering in the world. And we see here that how much of an importance it was for our forefathers on the highest levels is obviously when you're buried body, flesh, and bone in the land. But Joseph, who knew he wasn't going to get to the situation, he goes, V'alitem et atzmotai. He tells his brothers at the end of the portion, I want you to take my bones to the land of Israel, at least his bones. Get that in the land. And Moshe Rabbeinu, unfortunately, didn't merit in having that. That was a different level completely, and he was buried outside the land. But we see, first of all, number one, how important it is, the burial. That's so clear to everyone, that a burial is such an important thing, that the bones and the body will come to rest within the holy land of Israel. And we see today, to this very day, that there are Jews all over the world that go out of their way, which is a good thing. At least if they can't make Aliyah and move to the land, they say at least they want to be buried in the land of Israel. That's a very, very important thing, and they feel a need for that. We see the words of the Chatam Sofer. I want to quote another quote he talks about. He says like this, he says, in the book Torah Moshe, the Chatam Sofer says, when after Jacob requested to bring his body to the land of Israel for burial, he says, he brings down a Talmudic passage in Nazir, and he says, "The alfinan mikan hamefane kever sheitol afar min hakever imo shneimar v'nesatani mitzrayim." He goes, we learn from here, and the Gemara learns out, and we have to uproot a grave site. Sometimes people have to move the grave, and it says you should make sure to take the afar, the earth, under the body itself, when you go, so make sure that there's nothing left when you want to move the grave over. And here, there's a beautiful teaching, and he says, "V'nired dezeh hatam delo kava Yosef et Yaakov ad shepa'al rishyon la'alot oto le'eretz Yisrael. Ho'il v'im yikveru l'sha'a b'Mitzrayim v'fanei hakever yitzarach litol me'afar hakever imo." Because here, this is exactly why that Yosef, Yaakov didn't request Yosef to bury until he made him swear that he's going to take him to the land of Israel, because Yaakov didn't want to be buried first in Egypt, and then having to be uprooted and then moved to Israel even afterwards. He didn't want any part of that. Why? Because he didn't want any dust of the land of Egypt, of outside of Israel, being mixed up with the land of Israel. That's how he so much cherished to be buried in the land of Israel, didn't want any part of this unclean land of Egypt coming to the land of Israel. He wanted to be pure. In the cave of the patriarchs, only the pure dust of the land of Israel. Whatever as we see here from these teachings so far, that number one, how the yearning to be buried in body and soul, to be body together, of course the soul goes up to the heavens, but the body and the bones, the whole, it's a special level. It's so important. It was so important for our forefathers that they went out of the way. Jacob, of course we see it later beforehand, and Isaac and Abraham requesting, finding a burial place. How important burials, and it's such an important thing. We see it so strong. It's a strong message in the Torah itself. And now getting to the first real question of the suffering itself. The suffering in this world and nowadays. One question, the Or Chaim HaKadosh in the sixth portion, he has a long passage where he talks about, and he brings down, in the past we see that people lived many, many years. They lived hundreds and hundreds of years. And nowadays, life goes, people barely make it to 100 years old. So he brings down a very interesting mashal, a parable. And he talks about how a king, he gave out, in the beginning he gave out hundreds of thousands of stones, like 300,000 stones. And where he told his people of his kingdom that I want you can clean these stones, take care of these stones, make them beautiful, and then you give them back to me after you doctor them up and really make them really nice. And everyone is he's giving out the stones, and when it comes time to collect the stones after everyone is supposed to work with them and make them beautiful, they end up finding that many of them are already damaged, and not only they didn't make them beautiful, but they made them dirty and they damaged these stones. And the Or Chaim HaKadosh says this, he gives an example, is to a person's soul coming to this world. When a person's soul enters the world, every day, it says when a person dreams, a dream is like 1/60th of death. So every day a person, when he comes to this world, he has to rectify something. And when he spends that day doing something good, doing good actions, and literally beautifying his soul by doing the commandments and doing the proper thing in the world, so that day, that spark, he's quoting the Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari HaKadosh, that every day, when a soul comes down to the world, a person gets a certain amount of sparks. And each day one spark goes away as you do that particular rectification. So when a person begins to come to the end of his time, so sparks are dissipating more and more. But and you hope that, of course, each spark that goes up, that day you spent it as a worthwhile. And you rectify that day's work. If not, it has to come back. It can be through repentance, come back and be rectified. So he says something very beautiful, the Or Chaim HaKadosh, that in the past they lived so many years. But a lot of times in so many years, people wasting, unfortunately. People could waste, they've had a lot of years in the past, and they didn't utilize, like the stones. They got all these stones to take care of, beautiful stones, but they ended up making them dirty. So sometimes God makes them shorter and gives a person 100 years or less of a lifetime. And they have a certain amount of things to make them beautiful and shine and to rectify. And so it's sometimes an easier task. We see so many stones to rectify, it can be very hard. But in our generation, life is shorter. So we know in our time, we have less things we have to rectify. A lot of things have been rectified already. But we have to work hard, of course, and rectify those stones. And when a person is finished living a life of doing as much as he can, he did his share in this world. And then the time comes when Hashem decides the time has come to take you and go back to, again, the Gan Eden, as we say, the higher upper worlds, where the person continues to go. And we see from this lesson here in this week's portion is really supposed to give us, not to be God forbid, talk about difficult things. And the point is to realize is that, number one, we see that life goes on. Because our rabbis teach us that of all the places, the source that righteous don't die is from Jacob. It says, Vayigva Yaakov vayasef el amav. It doesn't use the word vayamot, that he died. It says that he passed away, he was gathered. It says Vayigva. It doesn't really use the word he died. So here our rabbis try to say that Jacob really never died. He goes, And the point again here is that a person doesn't really die when he lives a righteous life like Jacob did, and whole in body and soul. He's just going to another level, another plane where he continues to go on and on in a spiritual realm. Until, of course, we all know of the time will come when again, the revival of the dead, which we believe so strongly in Judaism, right? As Hashem will bring back the dead to life again. It's a fundamental principle. What that means exactly how, those are very deep concepts. But we know that there's a continuation. The important thing to realize is a continuation. So, and of course it's easy for us to stand here when God should bless us all again with happy lives and not seeing such tragedy in our lives. But the hardest part is when people, they themselves, that are in this terrible suffering in the world. You can't judge people that are going through such harsh times. Because, God forbid, we don't know what the person has been through and the person is experiencing. But the only way to find any comfort to us, coming from the outside, to understand, to prepare ourselves, is only through the Torah. The Torah is a place of comfort and the place of finding all answers. And within the Torah we see that there are hints right here. And realizing this is what Jacob was trying to teach. Galut, being in exile, Galut could be a beautiful place, right? But no. Let's remember what our goal is. Like the Ramban Nachmani says, you have to always come back to the land of Israel. That's where we belong. And we suffered, we were thrown out of the land, but we're coming back home again. Number two, to realize how important it is when the time comes when a person has finished this worldly visit and he has to go somewhere else. But again, when the time has come, the person realizes that he's done a rectification, and it's so important for him to be placed, to be buried with his fathers, to come back in burial, in body and bones and all to be buried. And this is what the beautiful words of Rabbeinu Bachye, one of the commentaries, he brings down, and he says something, an important message as well. And he says like this, he says, V'shachavti im avotai, and I will lay with my fathers, klapei hanefesh. This refers to his soul. Why? When it says, bring me to be buried from Egypt, go to Israel, carry me, talking about the body. So Jacob is asking, V'shachavti im avotai, when I will be lay with my fathers. That refers to the soul. Kolomar, muftachani shafilu tikbareni mitzrayim im avotai ani oleh. He goes, no matter what, I know, even if you bury me somewhere else, I'm going, my soul is going to my fathers. That's where it's going. But you're going to cause me some trouble, because it's brought down in the sources that if someone is buried outside of Israel, he has to go through all kinds of tunnels to get to the land eventually. He has to come back to the land of Israel. And that's what he's mentioning here. But he's saying something very interesting. He brings out an example. Afilu metadam bekaron o besfina. If a person passes away somewhere in a karon. Karon means a ship, like on a part of a train or a sfina or a ship. Or benahar, on the sea. Or b'midbar, on the desert. Nafsho kodemet v'olechet el avatav. His soul immediately goes back to his fathers. So your soul is yearning to go back to your fathers no matter what. So if the worst case scenario happens, when a person dies somewhere crazy, in a crazy place, or blown up somewhere in the heavens, in the cosmos, or anywhere, his soul will go back to his fathers no matter what. And that's in the cases where, of course, there's no choice. But we see that Jacob is saying, it's so important for me to make sure, I want you to swear to me that you're going to bury me in the land of Israel, and I want you to bring me back there. But no matter what, I'm going to be there, because that's what my soul is. But we see again here, I think in many directions, how encouragement to realize that in any situation a person's soul is drawn and will turn, a person lives a life and he utilizes life in a good way, even if he has a short time period in this world, that person has rectified himself, and those sparks will go up and he will connect to his family and to those, as Jacob did to the righteous souls of Israel. And again, we see the great importance of being buried in the land of Israel, and in body, when it's possible, in body and flesh and bone, or it's not, at least the bones, as Joseph did, at least get those bones back to the land. How important it is to stress that physical burial. We see something very important. And this, again, is a message to all those, and we hear it's becoming more common within the secular world of cremation, which is totally against the Torah, as we see here. It's totally against the Torah. We're not judging those who don't understand and make mistakes, but from here, it's so important that this lesson, if we talk about something and we spread the word about the importance, it will reach hearts, and that's important to realize that a person should not, God forbid, cremate their dead. But anyway, this was a lesson, of course, and we're completing the portion of Bereshit, and I want to end on a happy note, which should be a happy note, to realize that life is so valuable, and every day in this world we can do so much to rectify ourselves and to get closer to the Creator of the universe, and to be happy with our lot. It's so important to be happy with what we have, and every day to be thankful. So as we complete the book of Genesis, on this note, we see that Jacob went out and blessed before he left the world. He blessed all his children, and those children are his continuation of Jacob in this world. And we see that tremendous blessing within Jacob's children later on coming to fruition throughout the end of days. But what an interesting question that we think about this, we see every one of those blessings referred to a particular, according to Chazal, our rabbis bring down particular happenings of these blessings, referring to sometimes particular incidents. But of course, Jacob didn't mean to limit God forbid. The blessing is endless. And those special characteristics that come up within those blessings will multiply later on. It's sort of like a innate talents that within each of the different tribes have them. And if we see something like Samson, Shimshon coming along, the blessing of the tribe of Dan, it doesn't mean that only one person in the tribe of Dan is blessed, and that's Shimshon, Samson. Of course not. Jacob was blessing the entire tribe. And these characteristics that were outlined within the blessings are literally connected to the whole tribe, the whole tribal thing. And today in Israel, when we can see the tribes coming home slowly, and the return of the tribes, and the more people come back to the land, the more divine presence is shining in the land. And we will see how the blessings of Jacob will come to be in fruition, and the whole world will be rectified, and we will see the light of redemption sooner nowadays. Shabbat Shalom, Besorot Tovot, Yeshuot, V'Nechamot.